feel like I'm in an
Well,
elevator.
welcome everyone to the Offensive Security Club elevator. Um, my name is Tristan Fletcher, and today we're going to go over some web exploitation. First of all, Corbin, if you'd be so kind to advance to the next slide. Please go fill out attendance, because last week I had to do it manually because we forgot to mention it. Attendance.offsec.club, same link, go fill it out. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. So we had some current events this week, some primarily a note. There was actually a lot that came out this week. I know that there were a couple submitted that I wasn't able to put on here because I was having some difficulties accessing the slides this afternoon. But there's a couple of the things. Apple's T2 chip, their security chip in their MacBooks, was found to be exploitable. The developer of the exploit said that there's potential to bypass activation lock. There's more news on the way in the upcoming weeks. I'm assuming he has some sort of responsible disclosure thing coming out. Comcast voice remotes used for their TV systems. There was a hack called Where's the Remote that was found to actually allow you to listen in on a house that has a Comcast voice remote from about 65 feet away with full access to voice transmissions back like an hour or so because they cache it on the remote. So, interesting stuff. You can read more there. Submit some events at ce.offsec.club for next week if you find something cool throughout the week. So you're good. Some other events going on this week. New to Root is starting soon. Keep an eye out for more info on that. We'll pass it as we get it. I'm also going to plug our weekly Try Hack Me's. One thing to note is that the time has shifted to 6 p.m. instead of 5:30 p.m. as mentioned. Again, just forgot to update the slide. We will have some prizes starting out this week. There's some more info on, I believe, Angel, you put something in Slack earlier about that, right?
Yeah, I put an announcement earlier.
Okay, cool. So if you're interested in looking to see what we got, we have some cool things that we found for that. There'll also be some opportunities to do some Hack the Box throughout the week. So there is a Hack the Box channel on Slack. Most people will kind of try and poke in there, see when they're working. Hack the Box has some great learning tracks now if you're inside of there. So just join in when you can. Work on what you want. There's a lot of people that just come in to this Discord and stream their screens. You can ask them questions just to make you aware of some things going on in the little offset community here. So, yeah. So, as some of you might have noticed, we have a pretty cool logo that we use now. Thanks, Shane. Also, DefSec's logo. I am currently looking into if people want to order like t-shirts or sweatshirts for that. We could potentially give some of those out for competitions or prizes in the future. On the screen is a hoodie that I had made with just the OffSec logo, the URL like offsec.club, and there's a Cali dragon on the back. So if you're interested in stuff like that, there's just a brief like yes/no survey at swag.offsec.club on whether I should bother to attempt to look at a store and see all that. Just an idea. I know some people have expressed interest in having some club swag or a t-shirt or something. So this is just a way of gauging interest before we decide how far out we're going to go with this. So, and then I should have one more thing there, Corbin. Yep. Okay. So, if we're looking a little bit into the future of OffSec, next week we have a lesson on custom exploitation, so you're going to get into some Ghidra, I believe some Pwn tools might be mentioned. The week after that, we're going to have, excuse me, some red teamers coming in to talk about how you would red team for various competitions. Looking more into the future, specifically in the spring semester, we want to try to go into more advanced or specific topics and areas. So we might have something on like Active Directory pwning, like Responder, Bloodhound, evasion tactics, etc. But we just want to know if there's something you're dying to know, please go fill out the forum at topics.offsec.club. We want to teach you what you want to know. If people want more basic lessons, that's fine. We're just trying to gauge the interest of where people what you want to learn, where you want this club to go. We're trying to be very open-ended and broad right now, but if you want more specifics, we could definitely make that work as well. So if you have any ideas, fill that out. It's completely anonymous. Nothing should be tracked on you. I think you should be able to fill it out without your Trojans, but if not, let me know and I can open that up. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Corbin, who will go and talk about some web exploitation stuff for the remainder of the club tonight.
Alrighty. So yeah, I'll be talking about web exploitation, just kind of about the process of finding web vulnerabilities. So if you don't know me, my name's Corbin. I like web hacking. I do bug bounties. My Slack handle is CDL. So if you have any questions, you can ask me them there. So just a little intro about some tools. So basically, these are some tools that I use religiously that are super useful and kind of needed for web hacking. So Burp Suite is an HTTP proxy that is kind of, I guess, everyone needs it. If you can do web hacking, you need some sort of HTTP proxy to see what web requests are going through. Subfinder and Amass, it's a subdomain enumeration tools. ffuf, it's really good for content discovery and fuzzing. Nmap masking, I think everyone knows what those are. MassDNS is a really good DNS resolver, and Seclist is really good for wordless. So those are things just to note as I go into this. So I'm going to start off by talking about asset discovery. This is usually the first phase of trying to hack web stuff. So to start off, my first step is always enumerating the subdomains. So say example.com is the site or belongs to the company that we want to hack. So I usually use Subfinder as a tool to enumerate subdomains. I think there's a lot of alternatives out there, but I just prefer Subfinder. So basically, when you're trying to find assets, you basically want to find their subdomains. So after you've enumerated some subdomains, you can also brute force subdomains using a word list and try to guess what subdomains might exist. So you can use a tool like Shuffle DNS to do that. You could just use Mass DNS and make your own tools to do it, but Shuffle DNS is the one I use as well. So once you've enumerated some subdomains and you have a good list, what you should do next is resolve them using Mass DNS or some other sort of DNS resolution tool. I think Mass DNS is definitely the fastest one out there. If I'm wrong, let me know and I'll gladly switch to a new tool. So after you've resolved the subdomains, go through them and keep track of the subdomains that resolve to an internal address, and also keep track of the subdomains that didn't resolve to anything at all. I'll talk a little bit about why you want to do that later, but just keep that in mind. So after you've resolved all the subdomains and you have some that resolve to an address, what you should do next is generate alterations of those resolved domains. You can do this with tools such as AltDNS, DNSGen, and there's some other ones out there. So basically, you're taking a bunch of subdomains that you know exist and trying to discover more that conform to certain patterns. So for example, say you have dev.example.com. You could take a word list and guess dev/stage or /QA, and basically you can just find all sorts of different subdomains that might be in different environments like prod, development, stage, QA. So basically generating alterations is a really neat way of finding cool stuff that other people might not have found because they didn't try it. So here's an example of what the DNSGen tool does. So essentially, they can say foo.example.com. It inserts words on different indexes, inserts numbers on different indexes, appends words, extracts custom words from the list of subdomains you give it. It does all sorts of fancy stuff that you can read about in a blog post about it that's linked at the very bottom of the slides. So that's another thing you should do. Another step you should take is to find the network ranges. So you can go to this website, things like an ASN lookup site by a company called Hurricane Electric. You can just search in the organization name and then grab the results and just grab like the network ranges. Obviously, next you should port scan those. So mass scan, nmap, whatever you prefer. I prefer mass scan because I don't like waiting and I'm impatient, and it's also a lot faster. So I always port scan for every single port because I found a lot of things on non-standard ports, a lot of web servers on non-standard ports, and you can just find some really interesting stuff that you might miss. So after you've port scanned, you should take all the subdomains that you found earlier, start probing for web servers to see like what's online, what can you hit. So you can use a tool called HTTPX, which basically, like I said, is just a tool to probe for web servers. You can also screenshot. I personally don't do this that often, but it's kind of useful. So essentially, you can use headless Chrome to screenshot every single subdomain and then just save those screenshots. It's really useful to kind of get a good look at what different subdomains are just look like. So for instance, say you screenshot 200 subdomains, you can look through all the pictures and kind of pick which ones look like old web applications or just crappy web applications, and you can target those first. So it's really handy for people who are more into visual recon. So here's a picture of that HTTPX tool, kind of the output. I don't know why it was like that. After you screenshot, you should pull the HTTP responses from all of the web servers you found. This is just a good idea in general because it can really help you search for specific things that you want. Say you want to target servers that are running IIS. You can just grep for that server header and find those. If you want to find what's running PHP, you could search for Apache 2 and find a PHP header. It's just a good idea to always keep that. And I've had lots of luck just saving stuff because, for instance, there was a Citrix remote code execution vulnerability that was discovered earlier this year, and I was able to just grep for that Citrix fingerprint in all of my saved reconnaissance and then find a bunch of VPNs that were vulnerable to remote code execution. And that was pretty fun. You should also fingerprint hosts. You can use Wapalizer for this. I use the Go version of it, which is Web Analyze. And it's really important to understand what technologies your target utilizes because it's really important for the next step, which is content discovery. A little extra thing that I do, and I know a few other people do, you don't really need to do this, but it's definitely kind of cool and extremely useful. But you can scan the internet and pull TLS certificates. So within TLS certificates, there's some fields that are essentially common names and the DNS names, which contain just basically like subdomains or just like a domain name in them. So what I do is I mass scan the entire internet for port 443, or you can just scan the ranges of cloud providers like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, etc. You can connect to the hosts on port 443, parse the TLS certificate, and extract the organization, the DNS names and common names. And then I dump the results into Elasticsearch for searching. I just got a question that says downsides to scanning the entire internet. There's not really any I don't think there's any downsides to it. The only reason sometimes I just do the cloud providers is because if I want just something quick, if you scan the entire internet, it takes longer obviously than it would if you just do those ranges. But I basically spin up a cluster and distribute that to a bunch of workers, so it's a lot faster. But there really isn't a downside besides just slowness. But like I said, for searching. So here's a picture of a scan I did yesterday. So basically it has like the date, the server, and then all the common names, DNS names, the issuer, etc. And so here's an example of an API built around it. So this is also from a scan I did yesterday. Here's a subdomain of Uber. And this looks really interesting. It's like uprotect signing test. So basically, when I went to this website right here, it says uprotect signing test.server-side-uber.com. If you paste that domain name into your browser, I'm pretty sure that doesn't bring up a web server, and it doesn't resolve. But if you go to the IP address, it'll bring you to like what that website actually is. So basically, the whole purpose of doing this is you're going to find a lot of extra assets that don't have names that resolve to them, but they do belong to the organization. And by scanning cloud providers often, you can also find a lot of ephemeral vulnerabilities. You can find new web servers that are meant for development that you can pop and like get a shell on, and then all of a sudden you can get into other parts of the network from there. So that's why I do that. The next step is content discovery. So for content discovery, I usually start off with the tool that I created called GAU, or Get All URLs. So essentially what it does is if you give it a subdomain or a domain, it retrieves archived URLs from the Wayback Machine, Common Crawl, and Alien Vault's Open Thread Exchange. It's really useful for finding directories and files you may not have found. So here's an example of it running against dsu.edu. It doesn't make any requests to DSU itself. It just searches for that domain in those different providers. Then you can see all the archived URLs it found. It's only 10 of them, but yeah, it's really useful for getting an insight into applications. There's been plenty of times where I found a path on a website that I would never have found if I didn't use this tool. Another thing to do is Google dork a bit. So basically, you can find interesting pages that Google's indexed just by using a little filter. For example, say you want to find indexed pages of subdomain.example.com. You could literally just enter site : and the subdomain, and if there's any indexed pages, they'll show up. There's a lot more filters you can use, but I'm not going to go over them right now. You can look them up, and yeah, Google dorking is really useful. Another thing you should do is search on GitHub. So you can literally just log into GitHub, go to the search page, and enter the subdomain you want to search for. Or sometimes you'll find either developers' references to URLs that or like paths that exist on that subdomain. You can find API keys that will give you access to test that API. You can find all sorts of juicy stuff. There's been plenty of times I've also found the actual source code of the applications, which is obviously like a vulnerability in itself, is source code disclosure, but also it's really useful for targeting applications when you have source. Next thing is to actually like brute force, and I use ffuf, which is short for I think it's fast or fuzz faster you fool. So it's a beast of a tool for fuzzing all the web stuff. So you can find files and directories. There's an example command for that. You can find virtual hosts, and you can find parameters. You can do all sorts of things for it. Those are like the three main things I really use this tool for. So some tips for using this tool is don't just run it like as is. Make sure you match all status codes. Because when you run it without specifying any status codes or anything, it defaults to match only a few status codes, and you'll miss out a lot on that, a lot of content that potentially is still there. So what I do is I run a quick brute force matching all status codes, and then I Control-C it, and then filter by responses. So I either filter by number of words, the content size, the number of lines, and you can actually just use the auto calibrate flag. I discovered that a few days ago because it used to be broken, but that will automatically calibrate and filter out all the junk 404 responses. So as an example, Here's one of my sites I have, and here's just a quick brute force of using a word list of 4 words. And as you can see, it just ran it basically with the default configuration where it's just you just provide the URL in your word list. Then I colorize the output with the -C. And as you can see, it finished all 4. It brute forced it, and it didn't find any results at all. But when I matched all status codes and then auto calibrated, you can see that I actually did find the API. And so while that API still responds with the 404, there's still stuff that exists down that folder. If you guessed beyond that, you'll probably find API methods, a bunch of stuff you would have missed if you didn't use that and didn't match all status codes. Some more tips for using ffuf. Fuzz recursively, which is kind of a given, I'd hope. So basically, if you find a folder, fuzz down that folder more. There's probably stuff down there if it exists. Also, brute force according to the technology used. So, for example, if the target is running PHP, you should probably brute force for PHP files. If it's running Java, you should probably brute force for JSP files. One thing I do is I use Google's BigQuery to generate word lists. So there's a tool that basically lets you do this easily called Common Speak, and there's a link to it. Be careful when you do this, though. I've seen people accidentally spend $200 on queries. And yeah, they wrote it wrong and threw a lot of money down the drain on accident. So here's an example of a BigQuery using, okay. Yeah, so basically what BigQuery does is that it lets you query these large data sets. And so for instance, here you can see that I pulled out all the files that end in .jsp from the GitHub repos files data set. So you process like a ton of data, but it's really useful. So I usually build my word lists using BigQuery. Another tip is to scrape and spider the website and pull all the words and build word lists. A lot of times companies have different naming conventions, and yeah, if you use the words they use, you'll probably find more stuff because you'll be using the words they use to get stuff. I know that I've seen companies have specific files that you could already find using words in their websites. So you should definitely be building word lists per company. Also, this is kind of a very vague tip in general, and not necessarily just for content discovery, but identify patterns. For example, how are files and endpoints named? So for example, take these 2 URLs. Say you found those looking through archived URLs. So as you can see, it's example.com/app/sign-in servlet. Then you also see registration servlet. You should probably brute force words before servlet using words that start with a capital letter. So as you can see, it's like fuzz servlet, and you should definitely be fuzzing that with capital letters. Another example of like identifying a pattern is, I think it was a few months ago, I found a page that had a link to a file called device cache view. When I clicked the link, the file didn't exist and it just responded with a 404 not found. So what I decided to do is I brute forced words before cacheview.jsp. And I actually found a file called db cacheview, which disclosed some database cache info. And that was a pretty easy win just by noticing some patterns and just thinking critically. Another example is, say there's an API with create user list organization. You see how those 2 paths are camel cased. So you should probably brute force also with camel case. Furthermore, you should analyze the grammar. For instance, these paths are structured as verb, noun. Create is a verb, user is a noun, list is a verb, organization is a noun. So what you should do is probably brute force verb noun. I've had a lot of success doing this as well, finding totally undocumented APIs. So you should definitely analyze grammar via natural language processing or part of speech tagging. It's not too bad to tool. I have a tool that does that. For example, I pulled all the nouns out of like this page. So it's really smart to identify those patterns, analyze the grammar and how paths are named. You'll find a lot more content than you probably would have ever found. And you'll also find a lot of content that no one else will have found. Another tip is to brute force with the host header set to localhost. You might gain access to special features, internal endpoints, configuration files, SSL keys, and a lot more. There's a command to do it. And here's an example of a vulnerability I found a few days after Christmas last year on a very popular bank and credit card company. So essentially, I tried brute forcing the website just normally for content, and I found nothing whatsoever. Then I added the header host, localhost, and it basically just gave me, it was just configured differently. When it was serving the web root out of the Etsy directory. So basically, then I had access to literally everything. I was able to find the SSL private keys. And so, yeah, it was not good. But that's an example of why you should brute force with that host set. You should also brute force for virtual hosts. So essentially, what that means is instead of having that fuzz after example.com, you just fuzz where that host header, instead of localhost, you have that fuzz keyword there. But you should brute force a virtual host because you might be able to access internal applications and find all sorts of things you would not have seen externally. And definitely use those subdomains that didn't resolve and the ones that resolve to internal addresses. That works really good against load balancers. And you can find some load balancers just by grepping through your saved HTTP responses. So you can grep for server ATS, that's Apache traffic server, or you can grep for AWS ELB, which is the AWS load balancers. And I find that I've had success numerous times and actually had success on a pen test I did earlier this year. So I had seen a subdomain, internal.example.com, and it resolved to an internal address. And I thought that was really interesting. I was like, I wonder how I can get access to that. So what I did is I found the load balancers that the company was using to route their traffic, and I set the host header to that internal.example.com, and it routed me right into that internal web application where I was able to hit the admin panel and do some fun stuff. So I'm going to talk very briefly about some methodology. So say you found something with some content discovery, what do you do now? So basically, it just comes down to figure out what's going on, what the file or the API endpoint might be meant for, and how you can exploit it. Just understanding and trying to think critically is really important. Another thing to do is try to find parameters that the endpoint accepts. So you can guess get parameters or post parameters with Param Miner, which is a Burp Suite Pro extension. You can use ffuf for that too. I think there's some other tools out there that specifically do parameter brute forcing. Another tip is to request the page again, but instead of using get or post, use the options HTTP method, and also set your accept header to */*. So when you're trying to pen test APIs, a lot of times if you send an options header and that accept header, you will get, it'll dump out a waddle or basically a description of what the API does and the parameters accepts. It's really useful and gives you insight into what you're looking at. So I recommend doing that as well. I'm not going to go over all of the different vulnerability classes and types. You can go learn them using like Portsrigger's Web Security Labs, Hacker 101 videos, look at the OWASP top 10. You can get a subscription for Pen Tester Lab as well. Yeah. Another thing to do is when you're actually attacking a web application, you should try to enumerate the functionality and spider the application. So when I actually start digging into a web application, what I do first is I just use it. I log in, I click every single button there is, and I have my browser set up to use Burp Suite. And basically, I just log all the traffic that I make and just try to figure out like what this application does. Because the better you understand your target, the better you'll be able to find vulnerabilities within it. Another thing I do is I save the website resources. So I think there's a Chrome extension called Resources Saver or Save All Resources that I use. So essentially, I pull out all the JavaScript files from the application. I beautify them if they're minified, and then I just read through them. And I also use the link finder to pull out any URLs or paths that might be found in it. You can find a lot of API paths or API endpoints in JavaScript files. You can find all sorts of juicy stuff in there. So I really recommend doing that. And also you should test each functionality according to what it does. For example, if there's an update email functionality, something you'd want to try is see if there's a way to update another user's email. Say they specified an ID with that, that's the user ID. Say if you changed the user ID to someone else's user ID, maybe it would update that person's email. So that's what I mean by test according to each functionality. Also, if say the application fetches a resource from URL, you could try server-side request forgery. So basically just try to fetch an internal host, such as AWS metadata, hit internal applications, etc. A lot of web hacking just comes down to understanding the different vulnerability types, because the better you understand what they are, how they work, you'll be able to kind of figure out what might exist where. And so I found this methodology, I think it was earlier this week, and I looked over it a bit, but it seems like pretty solid methodology of stuff you should look for. So I'm going to jump into something else that's kind of interesting to me, and that's access control list bypasses and just exploiting reverse proxies. So basically, for instance, when you have an access control list, basically you just want to, what the whole point of access control list is they say you have an ACL, and what the ACL is basically it specifies what you should be able to access, what you should. So basically what we want to do is gain access stuff we shouldn't be able to. So when I'm talking about this in like web application, from a web application standpoint, there's a lot of times developers and companies will just have specific rules and like load balancers to block all external traffic from accessing a path. So a lot of times, say there's an endpoint that responds with a 403 forbidden or 503. There's a lot of times that they just are trying to block you from hitting that. So for instance, say there's this endpoint that's admin/sensitive that responds with a 403 forbidden. One thing you could try to do to get access to that is just add extra slashes. So I've had success with this lots of times. It's just a stupid little trick where you can just add more slashes and their rule won't match that path because you added the extra slashes. I've had friends have lots of success with this on big companies and have gotten shells because of it. Another thing you can try is adding semicolons in the path. So for instance, say there's this endpoint again, you can add a semicolon after admin, add a semicolon to the end, and a lot of times that'll also access, allow access and bypass the ACL. So basically what this is all doing is it's exploiting inconsistencies between load balancers and that other application that it's routing to. I've actually just used a semicolon yesterday to get access to a heap dump, And yeah, it's pretty simple, but can do a lot of damage. Another thing you should try is try spoofing your IP address. And you can do that by specifying some headers such as X forwarded for, X real IP, X originating IP, etc. There's a lot more out there that you can find just by looking up like IP spoofing or something like that. But I've had lots of success tricking applications into thinking that I'm already on their internal network, and so they just let me through. So that's something you should definitely do too. Another thing you should try is using URL path parameters. So for instance, consider you have this endpoint that's like admin/sensitive. Sometimes you can specify URL path parameters such as like ;C equals C sensitive, and it'll forward that and give you access to it because the rule doesn't match that, but the application sees this path. So yeah. Another thing you can do is just try to traverse back. This can be used in ACL bypasses, but it's also just good for exploiting reverse proxies in general. So for instance, say you have this endpoint, it's API, and you can actually traverse back ... and then a URL encoded / admin sensitive. You can gain access to what was forbidden before. Another thing you can do is use that ... semicolon / so that's usually works on Tomcat and all sorts of those web servers. So that's also something you can try. If you're targeting Windows applications, you can also use the ... or URL encoded one. One of my friends, Sam, he was able to hack Starbucks and access about 100 million of their customer records by utilizing this little path traversal. So there was this endpoint, this proxy endpoint that I just snipped, but basically it was like meant to be hit externally. What he was able to do is he was able to actually traverse back into the web root and then hit this internal endpoint that let him just search any Starbucks account that he wanted to. So that's something to be looking for as well. Another thing you can do to try to bypass ACLs is just change the host header. So for example, say there's admin/internal, and when you visit that URL, it automatically sends the host set to example.com, and it responds with 403 forbidden. Try setting the host to localhost, or try sending the header X forwarded host set to localhost. And a lot of times that will also bypass it, and it will think you're coming from an internal network and give you access to that endpoint. I had success at one of the live hacking events a bit ago, but basically there was an endpoint that dumped back the application's metadata. But if you didn't request it, if you just requested it normally, it would give you a 403 forbidden. But when you sent the host set to localhost, it would dump out all of the metadata of the application, and it'd leak a bunch of live paths and all sorts of other really juicy information. So I recommend doing that. Here's an example of something I found. I think it was this summer. So basically there's an API, and I saw that there was an API method that had the name system in it, and it automatically like drew my attention because it sounds juicy. So basically what it did is it would take a parameter called status, and then you could just specify it. And I had no idea what it actually did. So I was playing with it. So I tried just posting the status to it and changing that status to 503. The only options were 200 or 503. So I tried to change it to something else. As soon as I tried that, it responded with 403 forbidden. And then it said back to me that this API can only be invoked from localhost. And so I'm obviously not on the same network as that API, and there was no way I could actually request that from localhost. So I just tried to set the host header to localhost, and it worked perfectly. And then the host started responding with 503s. So don't take down production APIs, but that was kind of an interesting vulnerability I found. sort of by accident. But yeah, that's about ACLs. So if you're wondering how you can try doing all this recon and some of this hacking legally and get paid for it, you can try out bug bounty. This is something I do a lot. I'm really active on HackerOne. BugCrowd's another platform I hack on occasionally. There's a few more, but those are the two main ones that are really solid. You can just sign up for an account, pick a program, review the rules and the scope, and you're good to go. Then there's a link to the program directory in HackerOne where you can just find public programs and choose one to hack on. Then here are the resources and yeah, the links to everything I talked about. How much money have I made doing this? Let's just say a lot. You can guess and ask me, but I don't want to say.
That's a very interesting question. I was not expecting that one to come up.
Yeah. They can ask me privately. You can Slack me if you want, or guess. But yeah, I'm not just gonna say it. Any questions? No questions? Cool. Cool.
Thank you, Corbin.
You're welcome.